Fearnot, Part 2. Now, Mr. Mackay, possessed of a map of many colours, turned it round and round in study. His lip, pendulous at the best of lips, positively drooped after Fearnot's thrashing. "Well," he said sulkily, "I have here the route to a fine tower, but I must have a reward." Fearnot reminded him of the promise of the shillings once he was properly frightened. Mr. Mackay looked peevish. "You promise me much, but you give me only your fist, which I like not." On he went, muttering and mumbling, bemoaning his lot. I try, he muttered. "Then one little misunderstanding, and I am thrashed for my pains." And so they proceeded, Fearnot pulling their donkey loaded up with the 78 gifts, Mr. Mackay ahead, nose in the map, cussing and cursing, his belt of pots, pans, and paraphernalia jingling and jangling with each step he took. "Compare us," he continued. "You are blessed with great courage. I am cursed with a little cunning. I cheat for trifles. You can move mountains. Is that fair, I ask you?" Now Fearnot felt pity for the tinker, and held out the bag of shillings, but Mr. Mackay would not take it. No, he insisted moodily. "I'll struggle on for nothing. I'll guide you." And pointing to the horizon, he picked out a spiky silhouette perched on a peak. "We go to a castle where none can survive a night. That sounds an impossible task, and they'll therefore suit you." Fearnot put his hand to his brow and squinted at the castle. "So I'll learn to shudder at last?" he asked hopefully. Mr. Mackay shrugged. "We can but hope," he said. Now the castle they approached was a graveyard of hopes. There it stood on the horizon, a place of brooding. Enchanted, the king driven out, the rooms abandoned, only fools sought shelter there. For they had reached a troubled land where bad held sway, but fools there were, as always, tempted by the fabled store of fabulous treasure. Suddenly, the ground crunched underfoot, and, looking down, Mr. Mackay let cry a fearful shriek, for at his boot was a skull, and next to it another, and next to that another, and so on, stretching out before them, a path of grim bones, all that was left of their predecessors. Mr. Mackay was terrified. "Bones," he whispered. Fearnot pressed on, and looked down into the wide mouth of the moat. Dark liquid filled it. Fearnot investigated. "That looks like blood," he announced. Before the tinker had time to suggest they might try a smaller shudder but a few miles distant, a terrible moan issued from the castle, and the drawbridge swung open with a mighty crash. Fearnot was delighted. "Wait here," he told his partner, and rummaged through the gifts. "I should take something with me." Mr. Mackay was paralysed with fear. "Take a sword," he suggested. "Take two." But Fearnot ignored his advice, and decided instead on a small grinding wheel. "This will be enough," he declared, "or not, as the case may be, and it leaves you with 77 of my gifts, should I never return." Mr. Mackay was down in the mouth. "Oh, don't leave them here," he pleaded. "You know how it is with me. I'll be forced to steal them and desert you." Fearnot smiled a nice smile and took his friend's arm. "Have a little courage, Mr. Mackay," he said, and with that he turned and hurried into the dark bowels of the castle. A second hideous cry greeted his entrance. Mr. Mackay was beside himself with dread. "A little courage, Mr. Mackay," he reminded himself, and stood shivering by the drawbridge. The hall of the castle was vast and dark. Fearnot found gnarled candles whose wax had long since wept onto the floor, chairs lonely with dust, a long table heavy with secrets, and everywhere a silence with eyes that watched his every move, with ears that heard his every step. The only sounds were the tiny creaks, furtive scurries, and the wind keening through the shattered windows. Oh yes, in the cold hearth of the fireplace, fear sat, invisible, and waited. Even brave men would not stay in this place. But Fearnot wandered about with a hop and a skip, dipping into dust, eager beaver for some action. And it came. For suddenly, without a warning, a gust billowed from the chimney, and after it, with a bellow, appeared a man, or more precisely, half a man, for there was nothing at all below his waist. No one seemed more surprised at this than the man himself. "Hello," he said, astonished. "There's only half of me here." And ignoring Fearnot, he levered himself on his hands to peer anxiously up from whence he had come. "Where's the rest of me?" he demanded in a voice booming with anger. Fearnot had never seen a more ugly sight than this half-man with his severed legs. His head seemed to have nothing to do with his neck, his arms less to do with his body. For all the world, he looked as though he had been hastily thrown together from bits of other people. And indeed he had. While Fearnot looked on, astonished, the half-man dragged his miserable trunk around the floor, roaring with rage, until once more the chimney belched, and this time issued forth a pair of legs, jerking and twitching. The half-man let out a satisfied growl, scraped his way back to the hearth, and in a second had hauled himself up onto these legs. Thus attached and apparently satisfied, he took a few cautious steps, legs leading, body catching up, in a quadrille of discord. The half-man shook his head and muttered, thumping at his new legs in disgust. "These aren't my legs," he announced, accusingly to the bewildered Fearnot. "These are definitely not my legs." Fearnot shrugged, feeling unable to comment on what belonged to this man and what didn't. Instead, he offered his best smile and introduced himself. The half-man eyed him curiously. "How about a game?" he asked, licking his lips at the prospect. "Why not?" replied Fearnot. "I have all night." This response brought such a guffaw from the man it threatened to detach his heaving belly from his bottom half. "He has all night," he roared, most amused. Then he stomped over to a chest and yanked it open to reveal a collection of bones. "Skittles!" he explained gleefully, and set about arranging them in a clump at one end of the hall, thrusting the great table aside with a single flick of his wrist. "Good!" he declared, eyes gleaming. "Now, what size of legs are those?" he demanded, pointing a ferocious finger at Fearnot's lower half. Fearnot did not know and said so. Half-man frowned and stomped closer for a thorough investigation. "No gout?" he queried. Fearnot shook his head. "Corns, blisters, foot rot?" continued his interrogator. "No," said Fearnot, wondering where this line of questioning might lead. "Good, good," mumbled the half-man. "I could do with those legs. These are too short by half." And with that, he dipped back into the chest and produced a skull, then staggered to the opposite end of the hall, where he took aim at the skittles. "You'd better win, precious," he cried, announcing the stakes, "else you'll find yourself half the man you were." At this, he hurled the skull at the bones, sending 8 of them flying into the air. "8!" he cried, triumphantly punching the air. "8! Not bad on borrowed legs." Folding at the waist, he reset the skittles, delivering the skull with such force to Fearnot that he was knocked sideways, collapsing into a heap. "Careful," warned the half-man. "Don't want them pegs damaged." Fearnot picked himself up and carried the skull over to the grinding wheel. "You won't mind, sir," he said, "but your bowl is not round enough for me." And so saying, he brought bone to blade in an excruciating grind. In a few seconds, the skull was perfectly round, and Fearnot, full of intent, aimed at the skittles. His throw was powerful and true, the ball hurtling towards the bones with a smooth and deadly flourish. Up jumped the bones, every one of them dancing in the air before scattering across the hall. "Ah!" howled the half-man. "You cheated!" "No, sir," replied Fearnot. "I swapped a little courage for a little cunning." But the half-man was inconsolable, for even as Fearnot spoke, the legs pulled away from the body and lurched off towards the fireplace. The half-man himself, legs abandoning him, crashed to the floor and disappeared before Fearnot's eyes. Outside, Mr. Mackay, temptation nibbling at his resolve, picked through the lucky dip of presents. He found a beautiful goblet, studded with jewels, and held it up for the moon's approval. Then a silver plate and a diamond ring. "Oh, lovely," he murmured, greed goading. "All lovely." The wind howled around him. Screams curled from the castle. He shivered. "Run," said the little voice in his head. "Run, run, run." Inside, Fearnot, for want of a fright, settled down for the night. He found a bed piled thick with velvet eiderdowns and slipped beneath them. His legs nudged something cold. Pulling back the covers, he was met with a dreadful sight. Lying there, eyes closed, no pulse, no breath, was his friend and companion, Mr. Mackay. "Oh, mister," cried Fearnot, sad in his heart, "is it all up with you?" The tinker did not move. Tenderly, Fearnot touched his forehead. "Oh, so cold," he sorrowed. "You were my first and only friend." Grief and dismay welled up in Fearnot as he carried Mr. Mackay into the dark hall and built a fire in the grate. As the meagre flames dipped and danced, he held the limp body over them, wrapped in the velvet cover, and tried to warm him back to life. Just as sorrow was teasing a tear from the corner of his eyes, Fearnot felt the slightest tremble from deep inside the velvet. He unwrapped the covers, excitement mounting, and pulled back the cloth. Staring at him, with an evil leer, was the face of the half-man. With a mighty roar, the creature was upon him, thick fingers squeezing at his throat, a foul breath choking him. They fought, rolling over and over the damp stone of the hall, growl and grimace, might and marrow. Now it was Fearnot, forcing back his opponent. Now it was the half-man, cruel and crushing, threatening to tear the boy limb from limb. So it went on for an hour, this fearful wrestle, until at last, exhausted, with a final fling, Fearnot got the better of his adversary and dashed his head on the stone. There was a terrible crack as the half-man fell back and broke into 1,000 pieces, dust and fragments flying into the air. One moment he was there, huge and murderous. The next he had disappeared in a swirl of sulphurous gas, back to the depths of wherever he had come from. Fearnot lay on the flagstones, heart pounding, strength spent. The fire had long died, and the hall was pitched into blackness. "Fearnot," came a small voice from the dark, and again, "Fearnot." The giddy, swaying light of a torch flickered into the hall, casting a long shadow over Fearnot. Standing before him, trembling, was Mr. Mackay, his tiny, anxious voice echoing against the stone. "Fearnot," it pleaded, desperate. Fearnot sprang up, no longer deceived by this hall of horror and its mischief. "Come nearer, demon," he cried, "and I will cut off your head, and then there'll be 3 parts to marry." "What?" came the timid reply. Fearnot was not fooled. "I know it's not you," he said, ready for the fray. "Oh, but it is me," insisted the man before him, blue eyes blinking. "Oh, dead again, are you?" said Fearnot, tensing. Mr. Mackay looked very offended. "No," he said, and took a step towards our boy. Fearnot pulled out his eating knife, gleaming in the torch's flare, and swung it threateningly across the tinker's path. The little man leapt back aghast. "Please," he cried, "I'm terrified. I came with my little courage, and it's quite used up." Fearnot faltered. "How many gifts did I leave with you?" he quizzed. Mr. Mackay frowned guiltily. "Well, I could only count 77 to begin with, and I ate 2, 2.5, but there's still plenty." But Fearnot was not convinced. "What's the name of my true love?" he asked, ready to lunge. Now the man looked very vexed. "How can I know if you don't?" he complained. And Fearnot knew it really was the tinker, and was overjoyed. "Then it is you!" "Of course it's me," said Mr. Mackay, most aggrieved. Delight danced on Fearnot's face. "And you came to find me?" "And small thanks I get," the tinker moaned. "It's my lot. I try to break the mould and be decent, and I get a knife thrust at me." His friend was undeterred. "Come here," said Fearnot, "and hug me." "No," sulked the tinker, and he hugged him just the same. Oh yes, hug him he did, and there the 2 friends stayed until morning, while Fearnot told his tale and Mr. Mackay told his, and pleased as Punch, they both were with themselves. Then they searched the castle from top to toe, and behind the farthest door of the highest floor they found a room, and in that room was gold, such goldness they might have thrown it out of the window for a week and still be swamped. And they shared it half and half and a bit for luck, and never have two men danced more or merrier. And from a distance you would have seen the castle shake off its grey drab and sunbathe. The next day the boon companions, weighed down with treasure, set off on their way and found themselves not far from Fearnot's village. 1,000 thoughts haunted our hero as he walked. Why hadn't he learned to shudder? What could he tell his father? Where else could he look? Such conundrums consumed him as they rounded the ridge that led down to his long left home. And how could it not be so? For is it not the point of adventures that you learn much, but not the things that you thought of? At last they reached the gate, footsore and found. Fearnot pulled back the latch and beckoned his friend, but Mr. Mackay shook his head. "We say goodbye then," he said sadly. "But you must come meet my family," protested Fearnot. "No, no," said Mr. Mackay. "Families never like me." And with that he reached inside his raggedy tunic and pulled out the leather purse of shillings. "What's this for?" asked Fearnot. "You must return it to your dad," explained Mr. Mackay, "for you have not learned what fear is." And Fearnot took the purse and smiled and pulled the little man to him and gave him a huge hug. And from one side you might have seen a tear in his eye, and from the other a tear in Mr. Mackay's. Then he was off, Mr. Mackay, his donkey loaded with half the bounty of the exploits. Fearnot watched him go, a jingle, a jangle, a jumble of mischief and twinkle, watched him struggle up the path and turn on the horizon and wave, a wave that ran all the way back down the path to touch Fearnot's heart. "Goodbye, my friend," he whispered, and walked inside. There he found things much as before, father and brother busy at the needle, thread flying back and forth, and can you imagine the look he got, for when last seen what an empty head he'd been, the boy could not remember buttons. But how the sour turned to sweet when he showed them both the gold, how the weary turned to wonder. And while son scooped sovereign after sovereign from the bulging sack, while dad dug into the deep of diamonds, Fearnot told them of his journey. "The way is long," he said, "and the paths are strange, and still I have not learned to shudder." But they could not hear for the glitter, they did not care for coins. No, Fearnot was a hero, and that was that. They took him up and whirled him round, and delight danced with them. It wasn't until some time later, feasting finished and all forgiven and forgotten, that Fearnot remembered his sweetheart. He ran to her house, his scarf from the shores of Araby tucked under his shirt, his heart singing. Outside her window he did what he had always done, and he took out his fiddle. The sweet bird from Ireland flew up to the heavens, and the shutters flung open. But no darling at the window. Instead, her father, with a grim expression. "Come quick," he called down. "Hurry!" So bidden, Fearnot rushed up the stairs. The merchant waited for him. "Where have you been?" he cried, his voice heavy with sorrow. "She swooned when she heard you'd gone, and nothing will revive her." Even as he said those things, he ushered Fearnot into his sweetheart's room. There she lay on a bed of lace, her gentle face pale, her breath deep and distant. Fearnot's heart sank. He lay the silk scarf across her neck, while love skipped one beat and then another. He spoke, but the words came out in a tiny whisper. "I don't even know her name," he said in a voice of despair, stroking and stroking her lovely hair. "Lydia," said her father. "Lydia." Fearnot mouthed the name over and over. "Lydia, Lydia." He held her sweet hand in his. He trembled with the fear she might never open her eyes, might never smile that smile. But even as the little shudder took him, her eyes fluttered, came open, closed, opened, closed, opened. And she looked at her sweetheart, home at last, and smiled. "Oh, will you look at that?" said Lydia's father, as she sat up in her bed. But Fearnot could not look at anything, for don't you see, don't you follow? Fearnot had shivered. Fearnot had shuddered. "Lydia, Lydia, you've done it," he cried. And he kissed her, and he kissed her dad, and he kissed the walls, and he kissed the door, and he jumped for joy. "Done what?" asked his sweetheart dreamily. "You've taught me," he said, brimming over with happiness. "I've been so far, so long, and all I needed was the thought of losing you to teach me what fear was." And going to the window, he flung back the shutters, bathing the room in sunlight, and told the whole world of his triumph. "I shuddered," he told the sky. "I shuddered," he told the earth. And so the boy who set forth to learn what fear was learned it at home. And he married his sweetheart with her name and all, and never left. And I think, though far off, Mr. Mackay must have heard Fearnot shout, for he told me all this from start to finish a long time ago when I was very young, and I didn't know the half of it. The end.